Welcome to Charter California Edition. My name is Brad Pomerance, and today we are joined by Mike Ramos. He is the district attorney in San Bernardino County. And sir, every month I think there's going to be no new news in the realignment discussion, yet every month there is.
Right.
Recently, a couple of things have happened. First, we have some studies that talk about whether realignment has caused some spikes in crime.
Right.
And we also have a federal court decision that discusses whether the state needs to contract its prisons sooner or later. We'll talk about both.
Sure.
Let's start with the studies.
Yes.
So studies have come out recently which suggest that realignment may have been the cause for an uptick in, should we call them petty crimes, lower level crimes?
Lower level crimes. You can call them, we call them property crimes.
Property crimes, well stated.
And, you know, we knew that it was going to take about a year out, almost 2 years, before you can really get the statistics on what kind of crime is increasing, if any crime is going to increase, your violent serious versus your lower level crimes, which we consider property crimes.
And so do you, in your county, for example, San Bernardino County, are you seeing those trends apply? I know, for example, in Riverside County, at least in the sheriff areas, they have not seen an increase in property crimes. They've seen a decrease since realignment. What are you saying?
Overall, generally in San Bernardino County, we are seeing an increase in those lower level crimes, increase in misdemeanors, increase in your nonviolent, non-serious felonies, especially the property crimes, the 10851s, the stealing vehicles, your vehicle, burglaries, your typical thefts.
But do you know if the perpetrators or alleged perpetrators are those that were part of the AB 109 realignment program? Maybe they got out early. I don't, it's a loaded term, but is that who's committing those crimes?
And that's a great question, because that's what our office is now tracking, and we haven't had the time yet to watch and track those numbers. Are these the people that used to go to state prison, but now that they've committed a nonviolent or non-serious or non-sex crime, are they going through the revolving door in our local jails and coming out and committing a crime? Those are the people we are seriously looking at and trying to keep track of.
Because as I understand it, one of the goals of realignment, in addition to decreasing the pressure on the prison system, was to help these folks that commit these lower level crimes rehabilitate themselves a bit more quickly through being closer to home, rehab programs closer to home.
And that's fine, but when you don't have the revenue source to build the rehabilitation programs, and you just shove the prisoners locally, for lack of a better term, without that plan in place, then you have a problem. Now, I will say this, our probation department in San Bernardino County and what we're doing, developing the day reporting centers or whatnot, and getting these folks adjusted to re-enter our communities and society, I think we're going to do a better job in the long run. But for now, we got full jails. These people that used to go to prison, they're hardly serving any time, and when they get out and they don't have jobs, what are they going to do? They're going to go back to that behavior.
Do you have the revenue source? And the reason I ask is, you know, the governor, he said he was committed to making sure that realignment was not an unfunded mandate. And as part of Prop 30, he took what some would argue is a bold step. And in addition to having education be part of Prop 30, prison realignment was part of Prop 30. So there's a guaranteed funding source. But is it not enough?
It's not enough. There's a guaranteed funding source for probation, partly for our office, and then in this go-around for local city police departments as well. But there still needs to be more in the area of mental health and rehabilitation, as you talked about.
Which begs the question, because we know that the federal court over the last couple of years, who's overseeing this issue, has been just blistering against the state of California as it relates to its perceived failure not to decrease the prison population quickly enough. Although over the last few months, it's really done a 180 in my mind. And what we see is they've now given their third extension to the state to allow them to try different formulas, maybe the adoption of rehab programs, so that the state doesn't have to spend money to send them out of state or private prisons.
Right, and I think they have, at least, they're seeing what Governor Brown is doing, and what we are doing is law and justice community. We are attempting to put in place a system where your prison population is going to go down to the numbers under Plata and Coleman case in the United States Supreme Court. So they are looking and say, okay, they're working at it, they're working hard at it, let's give them an extension. But pretty soon the extension is going to run out.
I got to ask you though, the state's been working at it for a long time,
Right.
and the numbers have been going in the right direction for a long time. But over the summer, I mean, the court was just blistering against the state, and yet all of a sudden, you have this 71-page decision that's threatening the governor of contempt, and then 3 extensions within 3 months.
And I will tell you, I got a call from the governor about 3 months ago.
You did, yeah.
And he said, Mike, you're hurting us because
Explain.
your county continues to put a significant amount of people in state prison. And I told Jerry Brown, I said, those are your serious and violent felons. I can't put the others in prison anymore. But if somebody commits a crime like that, I have victims that I have to seek justice for. And until that stops, you know, we can do all we want and talk about rehabilitation forever. But until we get those violent criminals to stop committing violent crimes against our citizens, our prisons are going to continue to hold the number where it's at.
So you suggested that ultimately, eventually, the extensions will run out. But do you think that they will run out before the state, and I guess it's called the Prison Law Project, come to some type of settlement over the overcrowding debate?
I think eventually there's going to be a settlement. Remember, it's geared around the health care and mental health care of inmates. And I think if you look at the numbers, inmates get better health care and mental health care right now than a lot of citizens get in our community. So I think once that is put in place, then we can actually sit down and take a look at what are we going to do in the future for the state of California. Do we need to build more prisons? Do we need to build more schools? I say build more schools, but until we get there, we better make sure that we can keep these people responsible for their behavior.
Because there are many in law enforcement who say build more prisons.
Right.
I know Stan Sniff, who will be speaking with coming up later on the program, the sheriff of Riverside County. He believes more prisons should be built. I believe your counterpart, Paul Zellerbach, in Riverside County, thinks it's time to look at building more prisons. Is it time?
I think it's time to utilize the prison space we have, and then we have some other prisons that have been closed that we can reopen and utilize those before we ask the taxpayers to build a new prison.
So what would that, like Norco, for example? Or?
Norco's a good example. Also, I truly believe that we should have local jails, like in our county. Our sheriff was way out there in front, and we're building a local jail, which is going to look more like a prison now, having all those resources that you need when you have those kind of long-term inmates.
Right, which is an interesting point, because as we know, the intent behind realignment is those that were serving under 3 years would go to the jails, over 3 years go to prisons, but because of the way the law was written, there are people that are serving 10, 15 years in jails because of enhancements.
Right.
And so how is that working out for you?
That's a mess, and I really think we need to go back and rewrite this legislation, if not an initiative to the voters of this state.
Wow.
I truly believe that if you commit a crime and you are sentenced to 3 years or more in state prison, you should go to state prison, not local, even if it's a triple non, because we are just not built to house long-term prisoners.
Now, I believe that former State Senator Bill Emerson, he pushed that.
Sure.
Well, what he pushed was interesting. It was going to be a swap to avoid an increase in the prison population.
Those with 3 years or less, we're going to bring you over to the local so you can transition
to finish
and then go.
But that didn't happen.
Did not.
Yeah, the governor, I just think, was not interested in that
Governor
plan.
or the legislators were not interested.
So is it time for that plan to be revisited?
I think it's time to be revisited, and if nothing's done this year, I think it's time for us to go to the people.
That says a lot. I mean, those are fighting words, and are you going to start to kind of build momentum toward that?
I think that's another issue that we need to deal with, and if it doesn't get done, I will be there to push this agenda, because everybody forgets about the victims of crime. And nobody talks about the victims, and that's what we got to stay focused on. If we're going to have a community where it's safe to raise our children, we need to make sure that we hold these people responsible. So we're going to have to, if we don't get it done legislatively, we're going to have to push an initiative.
We'll have to see what happens. His name is Mike Ramos. He is the DA for San Bernardino County. When we come back, Paul Zellerbach, Riverside County DA, and then Stan Sniff, Riverside County Sheriff. I'm Brad Pomerance. It's Charter California Edition. Welcome back to Charter California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance. We're now speaking with Paul Zellerbach. He's the DA for Riverside County. We'll speak with you, sir, about realignment in a moment. We just spoke with Mr. Sniff about it. I want to speak with you about real estate fraud, though. To me, that's one of the most violative out there, because your home is your castle. And to think that there are people out there that are preying on folks in their time of just complete misery, and yet you see it all the time.
I do see it all the time, unfortunately, and we know that Riverside County and the Inland Empire have been some of the hardest hit areas in the nation with respect to foreclosures. And so, again, that lends itself to a lot of predatory practices with innocent victims.
And the predatory practices aren't so much focused upon the mortgage brokers that did their shenanigans, and we know what happened there with JP Morgan recently settling for $13 billion. You're focused on, as I understand it, folks that pretend to offer assistance when they're in a foreclosure crisis. Am I right?
That's a big part of it,
right?
Because people are very vulnerable, and someone comes to them and says, we can refinance your mortgage, save your house, just pay us this money. And they pay them the money because they're desperate, and then get no service.
Or just sign this document and you'll be protected, and they just signed over the deed to the house.
They did, and again, there's many forms that this insidious type of conduct can take, and that's yet another one.
So talk to us about what your office is doing, as an example of many DA's offices in the region, to try to combat this type of real estate fraud.
We have a specific real estate fraud unit in the DA's office where we have investigators. We just hired a document examiner. We're going to hire a forensic accountant. We have prosecutors from the real estate industry who've come in to prosecute these types of cases for us. And what we're doing this year is now we're going to regionalize. It was all centered in Riverside. Now we're going to go out to the Southwest County and to the Coachella Valley and have our real estate fraud units in those areas as well.
This is for real.
It is for real. We've also set up a website where people can go online and fill out a real estate fraud complaint form in both English or Spanish. That form comes directly to us and we review it. Matter of fact, this past year we've received over 2,500 real estate fraud complaints.
And what percentage of those would you say raised eyebrows?
Of the 2,500 we've received this past year, we've opened up about 100 active investigations.
That's for real. I mean,
that's
100 people who could have their home saved.
No question.
Can you unwind these transactions once they've been done by the bad guys?
It's possible. It depends on what stage they're in, but it's possible. We'll go to the mortgage lender or the bank, and tell them about the fraud, and sometimes they will allow the homeowner to stay there.
If it smells, is it likely rotten?
You bet. And we just started radio ads, as a matter of fact, throughout the county, again in English and Spanish, telling people to beware of these types of practices, giving them our website. Now we have a 1-800 toll-free call number that people can call in, and if it hit the nail on the head, Brad. If it smells bad, it probably is.
Right. What can we do? The website, the 800 number, and just keep our antennas up?
Keep our antennas up, but we need to do more outreach and education. And that's one thing our office is also doing. We're going to senior centers throughout the county. We're working with the Fair Housing Council and doing educational forums for homeowners. So
I want to talk about the bad guys and what happens to the bad guys if they do commit real estate fraud or any other fraud. Hopefully you'd think they'd go to jail or prison.
Correct.
And that's the question when we talk about realignment. We just spoke with Stan Sniff, your colleague who's the sheriff of Riverside County, as well as Lee Baca, who's the sheriff in Los Angeles County. I mentioned to Mr. Sniff, I read this article he provided from the Stanford Law School. It is just outstanding. It talks about whether realignment is working or not, and it doesn't take a Pollyanna view or an overly pessimistic view. It kind of sets forth the facts. What's your sense? I understand you looked at this as well.
Oh, I've read it numerous times. But what Stanford University did is they went out and interviewed defense attorneys, judges, probation officers, prosecutors, so they got a well-rounded view of what's happening with respect to realignment over the past 2 years. And I agree. I think it's a pretty fair analysis of where we're at right now.
I want to ask you one specific question, and it deals with crime. We've been speaking for several years now about crime trends and in what direction they're heading. And I always expressed my complete dismay. I was incredulous that crime was dropping during the recession. And we were trying to figure out why. Was it technology? Was it people who were too depressed to go out and commit crimes? But what this study suggests, and I'm going to take it for its word, is that we have seen an uptick in violent crime, as well as in one other area, I believe. Property crime. Thank you, sir. Since realignment. But that begs the question. Have we seen an uptick because of realignment, or because people are less depressed, so they're going out because the economy is turning around? Or is it because of layoffs that may have happened in law enforcement?
Well, the Stanford study talks about the state of California.
Right.
I really am more familiar with Riverside County experience, and part of the problem in Riverside County is not only issues related to realignment, but also our jail overcrowding problem and having to early release thousands upon thousands of inmates who should still be in custody, who reoffend.
And I want to be very clear on what early release means, because it really, in some ways, that can be so misinterpreted. The prison system, for the, quote, most serious, they have not been early released.
No one has been early released from prison.
Right.
We're talking about our county jails throughout Riverside County, and San Bernardino is experiencing the same thing.
They are. Most counties are. At the same time, what was so interesting to me about this article as well is that intuitively one would expect that if you are a criminal defendant and you're entering into plea negotiations, you would try to get the shortest sentence possible, and hope that maybe you can see a probation at the end of that shorter sentence. But because of realignment, what these defendants are now doing is they want their full sentences, because they now understand if they're lower level offenders, they'll get out early.
Well, that's what the Stanford study talks about.
Exactly, and there's no tail.
That's correct.
Explain.
And that's why I'm a big proponent of when someone gets out of custody, we knew when someone was in prison, they get released, they'd be on parole.
Right.
With respect to those felons that are now going to county jail, there is no probation supervision once they're released. And that's why we need to split that sentence and give them some probation supervision with terms and conditions, so they're drug testing, they're going to programs, they're doing
So we've talked about this. Can you mandate that? I mean, I know you're not a judge anymore, but how can you make sure there's that tail?
My attorneys can ensure it by way of plea negotiations, and judges can ensure it by way of imposing those types of split sentences at the time that they sentence.
So what's happening in Riverside County as an example?
Riverside County is one of the top 5 counties in the state of California wherein the prosecutors and the judges appreciate and understand the necessity to have these people on supervised release, and we're leading the state.
And what was so interesting is, even in this article, the public defenders were advocating in favor of tails.
Correct, because they see that as the best opportunity to get that individual to become a law-abiding citizen.
We also have seen through this article that some of these, one of the goals behind realignment was if folks serve their time closer to home, they'll have more opportunities to participate in programs that will help them re-enter society. And this article suggests that there is some positive evidence that those programs are working.
And I've been a firm believer of that. I think our local probation officers can do a better job of supervising these folks than the state parole officers were doing, because they have a better experience with the local environment that these people are going to be released back into.
The final area I want to speak about, and it's one that you have been obviously prescient on, is the question of lengths of sentences. Because within the last year, we spoke about your sponsorship of a bill, I believe now former Senator Bill Emerson sponsored it. Very sad about that, but that's another conversation. And it was to whether someone would serve time in the county jail, county jail or state prison would be determined not on their offense, but on the length of sentence.
Correct. And that's what the Stanford study also recognized. And I was appreciative that they bought into my thought in that regard. But we're coming back in January before the state legislature for them to reconsider this bill. It says that anyone sentenced to more than 3 years, regardless of the nature of their crime, they belong in state prison, not in county jail. And what's interesting, if you ask the offenders where they'd rather spend those sentences, 99% of them would say, I'd rather go back to prison.
Which is stunning to think about.
It's sad.
It's because county jails are just not equipped.
Correct.
I mean, they never were intended to be equipped.
They were designed and built and constructed for short-term housing.
Okay, his name is Paul Zellerbach. He is the DA for Riverside County. My name is Brad Pomerance. We thank you so much for watching Charter California Edition. Welcome back. It's Charter California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance, and our guest, Stan Sniff. He's the sheriff of Riverside County, and so I want to speak with you, of course, about realignment. But before we get there, I want to focus on crime trends. They're all interrelated, of course, but what we see in Riverside County, at least for the first 10 months of 2013, is pretty significant and statistical crime drops.
Yes, we are, and my fellow law enforcement executives from the police departments are seeing the same thing across Riverside County. The sheriff's office represents about 1.4 million of the 2.3 million folks that make up Riverside County today. So it's a pretty good indicator that we're doing something pretty good out there.
And we've seen some serious drops in robbery, aggravated assaults, burglary, small drop on larceny, theft, and then in the FBI violent crimes category, down almost 16%, property crimes down just over 3%. These are pretty significant drops. A noticeable spike in homicides, which we can talk about in a moment, but why is this happening?
Well, the department has fielded a lot of technology, and maybe a future show I'll come back and share some of that, because I know that's of interest to you.
Absolutely.
We've actually pushed down to the deputy sheriff and police officer level a lot of great tools through our Cal ID program.
Which is what?
That's the automated fingerprint system that started years ago that tracked down the Night Stalker. Both San Bernardino and Riverside County share that technology, except it's been expanded mightily to include all the way fingerprint identification all the way down to the patrol unit level.
Oh, I see.
And also facial recognition issues, DNA, all those things are kind of rolled up under one umbrella.
Now, yeah, please continue.
Well, we fielded a lot in technology. All the police departments and the sheriff's office, there's 11 separate city police departments, all great agencies that we work side by side with.
But you do have 17 of 28 cities in
I have
the county.
17 of the 28 cities.
So that's a significant number, obviously.
It is, and it gives a fair indication of the cooling of crime in Riverside County. But more importantly, we share a lot of information because we meet. So opportunities, threats, everything else that we can deal with, we share that information.
It's interesting. When you compared 2011 with 2012, we saw a spike. In some, I think I hypothesize that maybe it's because as we're coming out of a recession, people aren't as depressed, and so they're getting out and about and causing some mayhem and ruckus. But now we're continuing this turn around the bend of recession, and then the numbers are dropping again.
The county had a lot of foreclosures. There was a lot of social friction in the form of domestic violence cases and that sort of thing, and foreclosures that were also causing a lot of grief. The economy is turning around, not as fast as we like in the empire, but that is certainly a factor. One of the big things that have led to probably the steep drop that we would guess so far, and we won't count this until the very end of the calendar year, obviously, but the Board of Supervisors has been very good about increasing the staffing in the unincorporated area. And the numbers you cite are even higher in the 400,000 folks, that area, the unincorporated area that the Sheriff's Office serves. The drop in crime is even steeper.
I see.
And so I think that has brought down the overall numbers from the urban areas. But we've done a remarkable job because our staffing levels are going up in the unincorporated areas.
Which is surprising given that we have faced tough fiscal times. Obviously, though, we are on the other side of the recession, but still, it's good to hear that we don't see staffing levels dropping off a cliff. I do want to, though, talk to you about this interplay between dropping crime statistics and realignment.
Right. Because
a lot of folks have said that with realignment, we've seen increasing crime rates. Recently, I believe it was the PPIC came out with a study which suggested that at least for the lower level crimes, there has been a spike since realignment, which they think could be attributed to realignment. That, of course, being because lower level offenders are being released, I hate to use the term early, but they're not serving sentences as long as they would have.
Right, and even prior to their trials, they're being kicked out prematurely because they're a lower level offense when we have severe jail overcrowding.
So talk to me about this, because it does seem contradictory, counterintuitive, and confusing.
Well, there's two things. One, on the more serious crimes, many of them have been serial crimes like serial robberies, one person committing multiple robberies in multiple areas until they end up being picked up. There's a frustration level, though, probably that mirrors what those stats are on lower level crimes, because as you know, going all the way back to the broken windows theory.
Yes.
The whole idea behind community-oriented policing was to interdict at the lowest possible level before something became more serious, and also to demonstrate the community's intolerance for any type of crime whatsoever.
But yet here in Riverside County, it seems as if we don't see a connection between realignment and increase of these lower level crimes, because we have decreases in those crimes. So,
well, I think what you're seeing, and Riverside County is an excellent example, but our Community Corrections Partnership Executive Committee, we're 7 of us by law that are part of that, the criminal justice system, we've done a really good job as far as allocating the funds. Now, I think the jury's still out as far as whether this is going to be a trend in the long run or not. As you indicated in the opening here, crime went up quite a bit in Riverside County like it did across the state in 2012 over 2011. So we may see a little bit of a cooling period here, but I would attribute most of it to the great work of the police chiefs that we work side by side with, the staffing levels coming back up. Many of the agencies got cut back, if you remember, during the budget times in 2010, 2011, 2012. And I think part of the carryover in 2012 where we saw the increase is due to that. So it's a little bit early, but it is good news, and I hope we continue the good work we're doing.
I want to ask you more about realignment, if I may. I am surprised to say that yet another extension was granted by the federal court, allowing the state to push off the possible early release, and I use that term specifically, and or reassignment of prisoners to
other
facilities, be it private, be it out of state. I mean, I thought the federal court was just going to throw down the hammer and say, just fix it, and that's the way it goes. But I think now the state has until April, is that right?
I think so.
What do you think about this, sir? I mean, who would have thunk?
Well, as I've underscored to you before, and when I talk to community groups, one of the great problems we're going to have, irrespective of that issue, is even if they remove those number of inmates down through parking them elsewhere, quite literally, it's still going to have a state prison system that's 100% saturated.
Well, 137.5%.
And so the issue will be, what are we going to do to expand the prison system? And pretty much the discussions I've had with our legislative reps are, you need to begin pushing those buttons now strategically, because it takes you 4 or 5 years before one of those prisons pops up out of the dirt and takes additional inmates.
So
same issue as we do with jails.
Right, so where are we on this? Because we've been discussing this for a while. I know Riverside County is bringing more jails online.
Jail space,
But that was done a few years ago, even almost prior to realignment.
But we were also continuing in Riverside County. But on a parallel track, the state needs to follow that same example of Riverside County.
What's happening?
At the state level, nothing is happening other than building additional facilities for mental health and medical issues.
Which is important.
Which is critical. But additional bed space they're going to need is going to be desperate 5 or 10 years from now.
Will that take pressure off of regular bed space or not necessarily?
I think it does take pressure off. Irrespective, the state is still getting bigger. Riverside County has slowed, but it is still getting bigger. Most of the communities are growing. There's no way that we're going to go back to 1970 or 1900.
But here we have a budget surplus in the state of California.
I know.
I mean, the smile, it's shocking. I can't believe I can say that. But wouldn't now arguably be a good time to look toward using some of those excess funds for prison construction?
Yes, for 2 ways. Not only prison construction, but to help counties that are hard-pressed with jail construction, because we've had to pick up more of the burden during this realignment issue.
So where are we? I mean, sheriffs, they've been pretty good to Governor Brown on this question.
The sheriffs have all worked very closely with Governor Brown. Governor Brown listens to us very carefully. We don't always agree. But I got to say, he has been very astute as far as assisting us. As you know, just a couple of years ago, the Prop 30 issue was a big thing for all the sheriffs.
Who came out in
because
favor.
we're responsible for the jails, and he did come out and support that along with education.
And you came out in favor of it, the Sheriff's Association, which did a lot.
Well, it did because it guaranteed that funding that each of our counties is getting for realignment.
I hear you. Okay, his name is Stan Sniff. He is the sheriff for beautiful Riverside County. My name is Brad Pomerance. Thanks for watching Charter California Edition.